I'd like to call upon the first proposition speaker to open the case for their bench. Here.
Just to check, we can begin now, right? We need to put our speaker orders in the chat.
Um, yes, you can, but they're not necessary because we won't have specific ballots for outcomes.
Yes, I'll just set up my timer. Okay. Sorry. Drink a bit of. Okay. Uh, just to check, I'm visible and audible.
Yes, you are.
Good. Okay, thanks. To portray all men as evil is to antagonize men in general and establish power brokers of society. This is terrible for the feminist movement and women in general. We are very proud to propose. Set up then. Firstly, how do embracing this narrative of not all men actually look like? Firstly, I think we would probably be embracing the basic nature of this narrative. That being that we would embrace the idea that some men are nice and some men are perpetrators of abuse. We would also probably act accordingly to this narrative and set up systems or encourage others to set up systems as the feminist movement on how to educate women to identify a likely perpetrator of domestic violence. We think this will become very important later on in this debate. Second piece of setup then, what is the likely counterfactual on side opposition? We think the likely counterfactual is to continue the current portrayal of all men as evil or otherwise complicit in domestic abuse cases, etc. Why is this likely? Two reasons. Firstly, we think the feminist movement has been doing this for much of its history. Therefore, there should be no reason for it to change its stance towards men and domestic violence. Secondly, then, we think since the feminist movement has done this for such a long time, society expects the feminist movement to do this, and therefore there's no incentive for the feminist movement to change their portrayal of men as complicit in domestic violence and as evil. First point then on how this increases buy-in on our side of the house. Firstly, why do the feminist movement lack buy-in in the status quo? Three broad reasons. Firstly, the movement is broadly perceived as only for women and antagonized to men. Why is that so? Firstly, the feminist movement currently employs rhetoric that are antagonized or otherwise portray men as evil and as the dominant perpetrators or otherwise being complicit in domestic abuse. This is problematic for two reasons. Firstly, we think there's a one-size-fits-all approach. That's to say that this antagonizes men as it harms their self-esteem and makes them feel like the feminist movement are leveling groundless accusations against them as individuals. Therefore, it gives them a very personal reason to oppose the feminist movement as a movement. Secondly, then, we think this also fuels highly anti-feminist groups, such as online communities like incels, for instance, i.e., men who bond over shared hatred of women and believe that women are conspiring against men, etc. Secondly, then, we think the feminist movement currently do not have access to the levers of power. Why is that so? Firstly, the dominant social system of the patriarchy has been power for a long time and therefore is highly resistant to any attempt by feminists to overthrow it. Why is that so? Firstly, we think this is because that many people in positions of power within the patriarchy perceives the feminist movement as disruptive and antagonized towards men. This has been already outlined before in the first reason. Secondly, then, we think the patriarchy as a whole is highly resistant to attempts by movements such as feminism to unseat it from power and a position of dominance in society. In this case, therefore, we think it is unwise for the feminist movement to offend the patriarchy and makes themselves actively antagonize progress towards it, we think the better path is collaboration. Know that this perpetuates a harmful cycle as the feminists only antagonizes themselves further by pursuing opposition against all men and therefore making the patriarchy more incentivized to attack them on side oppositions in today's debate. Thirdly, then, we think there's also disillusionment within the movement. Why is that so? People within the movement also question this narrative as it's quite extreme and hard to justify. Especially, I think it is very hard to associate men you interact with daily, like if you're a woman in the feminist movement, i.e. your husband, with complicitness in domestic abuse and violence. Therefore, we think there's also internal disillusionment about the narrative on side opposition due to the fact that women, it is very hard for women to associate all men as being complicit in domestic abuse and violence. How do we solve this problem then? Firstly, we shift the broader societal perspective towards the feminist movement as we embrace the idea that not all men are evil. Why does this create change then? Firstly, this unlocks a vast door of potential supporters of feminism. No, this is likely to play into your decision-making calculus as the feminist movement because of a few things. Firstly, the vast majority of men in the status quo do not engage in domestic abuse or violence anyways. This unlocks them as supporters on our side of the house as they feel that they are respected and thus is free to align with this movement due to other things like their values, etc., such as being a liberal person, etc., right? Secondly, then, even in their best case, we still think this is a great thing, as even if we don't unlock men as supporters and men like don't really care about feminists on like both sides of the house, we still think it is better on our side because men now at least have no personal reason to despise the feminist movement and therefore makes it much more likely for the systems of patriarchy that exist and dominates on both sides of the house to not interfere to hinder progress, i.e. barring women politicians, for instance, on their side of the house. We think this is something that is generally good for the goal of the feminist movement in general. Moving on to the second argument then on how this is a constructive narrative and how this protects women. Why is that so? Firstly, in the status quo, the movement portrays all men as evil, which doesn't help women protect themselves. Why is that so? We think simply telling women that, oh, all men around you are evil and potentially would abuse you for like, I don't know, for like pleasure or something. I don't think this is something that is constructive nor beneficial to women, since it doesn't really tell these women how to identify potential abusers and how to react to abuse if it happens. Know that, Judge, this makes our side of the house makes this better for a few main reasons. Firstly, we tell people that some men are good, but some others may harm you. Know that this probably comes with educating women about what these bad men are most likely going to look like due to the fact that we are the side that makes the distinction between men who just act normally around you and people who would abuse you at home, right? We think this is something that is good. Why is that so? Firstly, we think this probably looks like, for instance, campaigns, gatherings, social media, etc., on how to like educate women about the signs of a bad relationship or an abusive partner. This would probably mean telling women to observe men for a period of time for signs before entering a relationship, etc. We think, therefore, Judge, on our side of the house alone, the feminist movement has an active incentive to protect more women from harm. Why is that so? Firstly, we think we make the distinction between men who are okay and men who do these kinds of abusive activities. We think this is a distinction that is okay for us to make because it is quite a binary choice in the first place. There really is only two options, that being people who engage in abuse and people who like are just normal and does not engage in abuse, right? We think, therefore, on our side of the house, the feminist movement probably has a significant incentive to educate women about like who are likely to engage in abuse due to the fact that they always keep the best interest of women in mind. No, this is not likely to manifest on their side of the house because the feminist movement is too busy in portraying all men as evil and cautioning women to not go into any things like marriage, etc., right? We think this is something that is bad. Why is our preventive measures more effective than their side then? Firstly, women are equipped with skills that help them recognize bad men instead of having to mostly rely on their own instincts. Secondly, then, we think even in our worst case, some women might still be harmed by men who act trustworthy but aren't. But we still think we achieve a larger impact than the narrative opposition has to push in the status quo, right? We think op just gives you a vague idea that you should be distrustful of all men without actually giving you ways to like actually enact this and identify people who can like be a positive partner, right? Especially when it is impossible to not interact with men like absolutely in your lives. Therefore, we are very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. Now call upon the first opposition speaker to open the case for their bench. Hear, hear.
Okay, give me a minute to organize my notes.
Yep.
Okay. Okay, start time my first word. What's the first thing they teach you about guns? You always assume that they're loaded, even if you know that they're not. You cannot tell if a gun is loaded just by looking at it. In light of such a radical time of our lives, as opposition, we think that it is fundamentally in the wrong to treat a man as if he were a gun, thinking that he will explode on you just by looking at him. Let's not trivialize and demonize the fear and precautions that women live with daily and inflict them on the mass population of men to perceive them of bad, misogynist, or sexual predators in the first place. Before anything, I'm going to make some front lines. Before anything, I think that not all men narrative literally means that it is used primarily by men as a response to online discussions by which it perceives blaming all men as perpetrators of gender-based violence. This is quite an extreme saying, I would say, firstly, because there's actually no net benefit of even doing or saying so, because there's no net benefit of even propelling the feminist movement in the first place. But secondly, on an individualistic level, we think that it's improbable to even embrace this narrative because there's an existing fiat in the status quo that acts as a prerequisite to automatically concede that this means that most violent perpetrators are men in the first place anyway. This way of thinking is ingraining and harmful at its best. Secondly, we never said that the feminist movement portrayed these men in evil ways anyway in the first place for a number of key reasons. The feminist movement wants men to be perceived in ways that maximize the movement's ability to reduce gender-based harm. That's the whole point of this movement, is to generalize men and women at the same time and bring everyone to the same equal playing field. For men, we see the movement giving back shared parenting and household labor and reducing burnout and builds family bonds. We also see comparatively the female side of the feminist movement giving women equal access to education, employment, property ownership, and legal reforms like no-fault divorce, suffrage, and also reduces economic dependence on men. But thirdly, they blatantly begrudge us to say that we crudely identify men. But I think that there's a misconstruction of what these conversations actually look like in any case of this scenario. I think that when the feminist movement's values are to achieve equal rights for women and for men, this is going to be a very small amount of debate on which women exist on both sides. Ultimately, I think this debate falls into this distinction that those who make these generalizations in the first place are either those who are truly victims and cannot feel safe around men, or just words which are misperceived on side proposition as an attack against all men in the first place. Now, moving on to some framing. 3 points that both sides should be able to agree on. The first being, what does the feminist movement want in terms of how men are perceived? The feminist movement wants men to be perceived in ways that maximize the movement's ability to reduce gender-based harm. 3 key examples here. The movement doesn't want men to be villainized as a homogenous group. They don't want to claim all men as perpetrators, and they don't critique systems and institutional bias, not men directly. Note that in here, feminism wants men perceived in ways that allows for allyship and pattern recognition. That's the way feminism can even reach more ground and more audience in the first place, because the whole goal is not just to get all women on board. But secondly, what does effective feminist communication require? No, thank you. Communication needs maintaining the control over narrative focus and naming systemic harms. Note that here the conversation should still recenter to survivors and the core of it, and not male reassurance. We think the critique of not all men narrative requires a generalization in the first place to happen, which would assume that there are people that think that men are the villains in the first place. Also, rhetoric that undermines the feminist movement had often been preyed on unclear narratives that the feminist movement has provided to us. Like in 22 to 23, when there was a big surge of content that made fun of the most viral interpretations of feminism, in which a small group of people said that men were not needed. In today's round, this is a similar case. And even if that is a small of population that believes so, they go viral because of a single misinterpretation, which overall harms the movement in general. But thirdly, why do men feel attacked and why do they even need the not all men narrative? I think under the narrative in the first place, men often feel personally attacked in conversations about gender-based violence because they're interpreting this critique of the system as an accusation against their character. This mechanization is led by the psychological impulse to simply defend yourself. And even if this isn't true, that men was never being attacked in the first place, we can clearly see that people still feel this way because the narrative exists in the status quo anyway. It's not unique. That's why they think the narrative is important because that is their ultimate self-defense. Both sides can agree that we don't want men to feel like they're being generally attacked. This debate then comes down and boils down to whoever
Point.
decreases the amount that men feel attacked in the first place. Men are also seen as majorly abusive because the not all men wording makes it look like good men are extremely rare, perhaps in the 0.1%, whereas perpetrators are now seen as a majority of the male populace. So under this, what does it mean to even oppose the narrative for the feminist movement? Three things. Firstly, movements like the feminist one needs to be alive in the first place to function, but secondly, they need social cohesion within the movement. But secondly, gender wars, etc., or something can spark and demonize feminist movements. So if we push the narrative, are men the rapists out there? But thirdly, what exactly are the ideological values of the feminist movement in general? We say that there are a couple things they want to achieve: equality for women and abolishing patriarchal structures. But I think the most important values to debate is sort of the independence the feminist movement wants to achieve, which includes forging their own paths regardless of any hate or animosity directed towards them. Now, onto contention one, which is individualizes what is fundamentally structural. Feminism analyzes patriarchy as a system. The narrative, like men harass women in feminist discourse, is basically shorthand for man as a class they are in nature belongs to, or disproportionately the very perpetrators within a gendered system. We think that in this world that we live in, patriarchy operates as a system where men, as a collective class, holds disproportionate power through institutionalized advantages like the wages they hold, legal biases in family courts, and cultural norms excusing male aggressions. Two reasons for this here. Firstly, not all men collapse into this. Some bad apples basically makes the whole basket rotten sing. This narrative blatantly ignores how even good men benefit from and perpetuate the system via plain inaction or the normalization of sexism. But secondly, feminists traditionally use extremely stereotypical generalizations like men oppress women as shorthand for class dynamics and not literal universality, which is the same way economics say capitalists exploit labor without explicitly naming every CEO that does so. The tolerance we face is bad. One, on an individualistic level, but two, on the macro level, the feminist movement for three reasons. Firstly, it blocks the path to policies being negotiated. Secondly, because of cultural shift. And thirdly, the allyship needed for liberation in the first place. Under this, we can explain the mechanism designed for failure with three layers. Men crave absolution and not transformation. Not all men, sure, we can not sympathetically, but saying, oh, you're a good guy. You're one of the good ones that can clock out so much more effectively. Real allyship actually demands discomfort because trivially, the claim that men as a group perpetuate harassment cues and completely shuns the endless examples of good men. But secondly, we see that in a lot of modern day, feminists zero in on how beneficial feminism is to men. If feminism has a net zero benefit to men, you ask the men in this movement, why are they feminists in the first place? And they talk about sex positivity and splitting the bills, as those are things that they directly benefit from, arguably even more than a woman. But thirdly, in the world that we live in, I think it's unfair that while women are people and therefore aren't perfect, and neither are men, people don't understand this. I get that generalizations happen, especially when frustrated, but when a guy generalizes a woman, we all recognize that he's speaking based on a few bad experiences. So why do we demonize the same corrections when aimed at men? Contention two is delegitimizes trauma and victims of sexual assault. As a collective society, we value and respect the stories of victims insofar as it provides an unfiltered experience of the dehumanization and pain that you can possibly go through. When the not all men narrative aims to essentially filter out what can be considered hurtful, we silence the voices of the people and victims alike. When prop uses the not all men narrative, it then shifts the conversation from survival experience into then talking about whether men are to blame and whether we should reassure them in the first place. This looks like changing from what happened to me as a woman and pivoting it to don't blame me as a man. Secondly, we think that the issue of not all men is only legitimized by the feminist movement when the light is shined on it anyway, because it subconsciously acknowledges that the feminist movement have been lacking rhetoric against the entire male populace. And for all of these reasons, we are so proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. Now call upon the second speaker from proposition to continue the case from their bench. Hear, hear.
Hi, am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. So my speech will start on my first word, starting with the quick observation panel. If Op wants to be nice to all men while also protecting women and opposing the patriarchy, what is their case? What is their counterfactual? Because their case that they can only defend because probably they have not given us another counterfactual, and we think that that is the most likely, is the status quo, right? What is the status quo? It is where like kind of the feminist movement is telling like women and definitely like the whole world through campaigning, social media, and others that all men are basically like potential like abusers, right? Anyone could like potentially harm you at any moment. They're telling you, we think that this already like puts men as like at like a negative image, at like a negative leverage. We think that this already goes against their kind of like rhetoric about how the feminist movement does not have like the incentive to make men seem negative, because we think that at first the feminist movement gains multiple followers by proving to others that, oh, we are against men and therefore this is our stance. But we think that now, since it's like the new era, right? Women have realized that, like, you know what? We know that, oh, we are living under this patriarchal society. And next, what needs to happen is like telling them how to actually differentiate, telling them how to find men who may like be more trustworthy, and like telling them that, oh, these are some ways that you could, I don't know, identify like men easier if they're like really bad or if they're like more potential abusers. We think that they haven't really given us a better counterfactual in any sort of way, and they kind of ran this entirely negative case without truly responding to, for example, or like points about like kind of like protecting women more. So moving on to some more rebuttals. Firstly, they talk about how the feminist movement doesn't want men to be perceived in negative ways to build allyship. We think that currently in the status quo, the movement is saying that all like men are potential abusers, right? Which means that you should be extremely cautious of all of them. We think that this already portrays men in negative ways. So if they want to use this as their main push, they are not doing well as well. We think that because like actually on op they're perceiving men to be even more negative, because many men who feel that they haven't done anything wrong, such as abuse, or like they've never have like any sexist thoughts, which we think still takes up like a percentage. We think that those men would be probably neglected. They feel like that they're not really recognized, which we think actually places them at like which actually kind of blocks them from allyship. Furthermore, we think that these men are the ones that like the feminist movement is more likely to build allyship with. You're not gonna build allyship with like an abuser or someone else, right? You're gonna build that allyship with these men who are currently feeling neglected and as if they're not really being understood. No, because of how the feminist movement is currently being kind of more portrayed as something that's just for women or like members of the LGBTQ community and just protects them. We think that on our side, we're more likely to build this allyship because of kind of this more like recognition that there are good men, that not all men are bad. And we think that this allyship is so important because the feminist movement probably does want to gather more people in the middle ground in order to reshape their image as like a movement of not just restricted to women and like members of the LGBTQ community, but like a movement that is okay for everyone and just promotes gender equality. So secondly, they talked about how like this narrative actually portrays good men as only a small percentage, and how this really kind of like is bad. We don't think that a majority of men have not said anything sexist or have not made any like sexist jokes or like something like that. We don't think that this thing that they have claimed is necessarily bad, because good men are definitely not like majority, right? These things aren't just about abuse and like other severe crimes. It's also about having these thoughts that go against women and will harm women, such as believing that a woman's best role is to cook at home or like something else like that. Because we think that these men have lived under the patriarchal system for such a long time that it's already have become like kind of like this mindset that perhaps men are more superior. We think that probably this is why like we think that even if this does portray good men as an only small percentage, we don't think that is like wrong, right? We want women to, even though recognize that there are good men, we also want them to learn better that there are that even though there is like good men, right? Like that bad men are also existing around the world, and that you have to try and like prevent yourself from that. And we think that also on our side, we're better able to educate them. Why? because we have this differentiation, which I don't think really happens in opposition. Because in opposition, their counterfactual is where the movement tells everyone majorly that all men are kind of like evil and like portrays them in that way, which we think not only villainizes men more, creates this like widens this gap between like these like men and like women, but also we think that this actually does not really help women identify like ways men. So then they talked about how this actually portrays all violent actors as men, which is harmful. We think that firstly this is probably true because most people who have committed rape against like women or like men or like whatever have mainly been men because living under this patriarchal society don't face that much backlash that like if like even if it's not rape or it's like something other like sexual abuse or like kind of enforcing these stereotypes on women, it's not very like in their ideas, this is okay since they have lived under this patriarchal society for such a long time. We think that they have no mechanization on how their side like paints all men as good, right? They don't say anything. They're working towards the status quo where men are not like portrayed as all good, which I don't think that they are able to provide a better counterfactual in this case. In their best case, their negative impacts are
You are.
mirrored, but realistically, we have more benefits later up. Yeah, more benefits. Their impacts are mirrored, but realistically, we have more benefits because we paint men and more as allies and helping with the goal of feminism instead of like opponents. Yeah.
So, okay, maybe we can accept the fact that our counterfactual does not prove all men as good men. But how does it happen on your side when you earlier just said that we can accept that the majority of men are bad?
Yeah, we think that that is true because we need to have this thought that not all men are good. And we think that it is reality that a majority of men have enforced these stereotypes because they have lived in this patriarchal world. We don't think that this is necessarily a negative impact. And we think that because but we still do have that differentiation, right? Some men are good and like some other men are bad. But the problem is that this like percentage of good men, we need to form allies with them. We have to recognize that they're good. We have to recognize that even though the percentage is small, there are men who have not committed these crimes or like any other form of harm towards women. And we think that that is not only more principally just, but also actually allows we told you completely like 50 times already, Judge, that we're actually able to make this differentiation. Instead of saying that you should be cautious to all men, like all men, we're telling women that, oh, because like there are good men and there are bad men and not all men are bad. Therefore, we think that this differentiation is necessary, that you're better able to prevent yourself from bad men because you're taught, for example, what are some signs of a bad relationship and like bad men you should avoid? What are some signs that a person is trustworthy and perhaps you can trust them a little bit, but you have to observe over a long term. We think that we are able to achieve not only like these like principle, like we're able to win on principle, but we also provide you these practical benefits, which are definitely in the interest of the feminist movement, right? Then finally, they say that this shifts focus away from the patriarchal like system. We think that the system has existed for such a long time, such a large problem that this is probably pretty much impossible. So therefore, we want to take this debate as prop. Thank you.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. I now call upon the second speaker from opposition to continue the case for their bench. Here, here.
Okay, am I audible and visible?
Yes.
All right. My speech will begin on my first word. Just give me a second to organize my notes. Judge, I think when side proposition comes up here and tells you that because of these incels or like misogynistic men in society, that we must bend to their will and essentially reframe everything we know about the feminist movement, they have already lost this debate. They have already reached a point in which they are not the feminist movement, but they have gone backwards in time to become something that they're not. And for this reason, I'm so proud to oppose. A couple of things I'll be doing for you. Firstly, on some clarifications of our framing and counterfactual before moving on to some refutation contention of side proposition, and then a third contention on overshadowing the root problem. So a couple of things I need to address on our counterfactual, right? We already gave you the mechanisms for why the feminist movement wants what it wants, right? We firstly told you that because they want this sort of equality for women, there's probably not going to be all of this animosity that we see on their side when they frame women as someone who only care about like what these men say and they only care about demonizing men. I don't think this is a likely scenario in society, but I'll explain this later. But secondly, we also say that this is about abolishing patriarchal structures. So ultimately, when they talk about these incels, which I think will exist under both sides of this house, this still means that we are able to achieve more change on our side. But thirdly, we also gave you the most important value in this debate is the independence of women in the feminist movement, where regardless of any animosity or hatred we get towards women, this is still about them being able to self-realize and self-actualize their own past. This means things such as body positivity, even in the face of like anti-abortion laws. And for this reason, their case has already fallen. Now, moving on, we also think that in the case that we do agree this is a problem because of the wording of people, or for example, there is this misconstruction of what
POI.
women actually mean when they say all men. I think this already implies this is what the feminist movement has essentially chosen, regardless of misunderstanding, because I think this often comes from a principalistic sense, or in the case of a rape victim, I'm probably going to have a lot of trauma towards men. I'm probably going to feel as if I cannot feel safe around them. And for this reason, I suddenly have all of these men attacking me, and any embracement on side proposition comes at the trade-off of this autonomy they have worked so hard to create. But moving on to some refutation, the first thing they tell you is on our counterfactual, right? Already our counterfactual has been explicit when we told you that what we do is achieve freedom of speech. We reject this not all men archetype because it offers an outlet for incels and sexism to essentially attack women for what they say. But the counterfactual is one where we reject people that say that men in general are bad. We reject people that say we don't need men. I don't get why they feel as if this is exclusive to their side when this can happen under both sides of the house, because that's exactly what happens in the status quo. And we think they misinterpret what the status quo actually looks like. So even if we gave them the
POI.
time, we wouldn't be able to fish up an example, I'll take that later, where women actively wanted to portray all men as the villain, in which the core feminist movement does not, right? Yet we can give you examples like the 2023 to 2023, 2022 to 2023 content surge of how feminism tried to cut off those that pushed for the wrong idea. So already we know that women don't want to point fingers at people, and I'll take that POI.
Sure. So your first speaker told us that it is immoral to portray all men as homogeneously evil. How would you portray like men on your side of the house? Like, so what is like the case stance on your
Okay,
side?
again, we already gave you the status quo and we already gave you our counterfactual, right? The counterfactual is that we just portray men as men. We acknowledge that there are some bad ones, but we also acknowledge that there are some good ones. Comparatively, on your side, because there's this animosity on both sides of the house with men and with women, this just incites gender wars and causes more generalization when men inherently internalize the fact that women think of them as only evil and only horrible. For this reason, you have already lost this debate. But moving on to just some things that they have said on their side, right? The first thing they tell you on the first proposition is this idea that you are essentially perpetuating this narrative that basically all men around you are abusers and evil, right? I think there's a misconstruction of what these conversations actually look like. In any case, I think when the feminist movement's values are to achieve equal rights for women to men, this is going to be a very small amount of women, which then again still exists on both sides because radicalization is always going to be inevitable in small pockets of people, right? But ultimately, I think this debate falls into the distinction that those who make these generalizations in the first place are either those who are truly rape victims or like victims of trauma and cannot feel safe around men, or just words which are misperceived on side proposition as an attack against all men. I think this is still going to be likely because incels on their side are always going to use some sort of justification. But even if we were to buy this characterization that women truly do have this profound hatred of men from the start, which they will perpetuate to other women, the only thing that side proposition achieves is greater animosity when the not all men stereotype is already an attack, is already a counterattack on women when side proposition themselves frame that there are incels online who will already be predisposed to this sort of misogyny. All they do is assume the appeasement that contradicts the independence the feminist movement tries to assume. Now, on their second, they tell you that the feminist movement does not want to negatively portray men, and that's what we're doing, right? We agree that the majority of men probably have no grudge against women in the first place, but it doesn't make sense as to why you would have to stick your foot into the already negatively perceived stigma in the status quo that, oh, men are in nature more predominantly predators, because not all men face an ingrained stigmatization when there's a small portion of men who are good and the rest are all like these evil rapists on their side, right? But moving on, we also tell you that in their answer to our POI, what do we see? One clarification here, that they can see that on average, almost all men are bad anyways. So how do they have this differentiation in the first place when if we hold them to their highest, 8 out of 10 men we pass on the street has had a record of abusing women in the worst case scenario? If this is the case on their side, then do they really believe that going back to reality is if they really lived in this patriarchal world by handing out flyers with not all men written on them will really switch the mindsets of everyone, all of these misogynistic people, or for example, those who are sexist, and revert the feminist movement to something that is perceived as inherently good? I don't think this is the case. This just means that you're going to be more ingrained into the patriarchal system that we already have instead of actually opting for real change on our side. But moving on to the third contention then uh on overshadowing the root problem. Ultimately, when this narrative of not all men is used to combat what is perceived as overgeneralization on an entire gender, it fails to grasp the core and fundamental injustices present in our status quo, i.e. through the trauma, inequality, and vulnerability that women face. A couple of layers to this. I think there are a couple of characterizations that need to be made that I'm shocked haven't come from the proposition side of the bench yet. The first key piece of framing is what happens in gender wars like these. If I, as a man, am offended by the words the feminist movement has to say because I feel it demonizes me, I'm less inclined to listen to everything else they have to say. I fail to recognize the core lessons, such as inequality, injustice, and violence that women face as opposed to men, because I cannot agree with their core framing that I perceive as hate towards me. And I think this also manifests itself in a few ways. I genuinely feel maddened and resentful against this perceived generalization, and in the case that I do truly feel as if they are an enemy against myself, I find myself less inclined to believe in that in what they say. I think this leads to more problems down the road when now you, as the feminist movement, have those under you who are resentful against the intrinsic censorship of victims. But secondly, this results in the gender wars online that we are all too familiar with, where because I continuously fight against this narrative with even more animosity, we have all but lost the core lesson at the end. But let me give you an example of what happens on side proposition to close off this debate. I listened to a rape victim pouring her heart out to express the pain and trauma she has endured, the dehumanization he has experienced, and I'm offended by it because of the wording she brings up. All of that core meaning is lost because I bring up the not all men narrative. I make it into something that is not, and for this reason, I'm so proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. Now call upon the third speaker from proposition to close the substantive case for their bench. Here.
Okay. My time will start on my first word. Panel, Op wants you to reject the not all men narrative, claiming that by focusing on individual behavior, we can distract from the fight for gender equality or something. We reject this claim entirely by recognizing that the men who actively support gender equality, we build a more unified environment that can address issues more effectively. We argue that by embracing not all men, we open the door to broader male engagement in feminist movements, which helps to challenge the systems of patriarchy that sustains gender inequality. We need men to help call out harmful behaviors or push for legislative change to create a stronger movement. We reject that focusing on the structural nature of patriarchy should exclude men from the feminist conversation. We urge you to vote for the side that makes feminist movements stronger, more inclusive, and therefore more impactful, leading to more change. So proud to propose. First, starting with some rebuttals of opposition substantives. They push that the independence of women is the most important thing in this debate. First of all, there were no mechs on this, and also we reject this framing. The idea that women should achieve independence without the support and engagement of men is just unrealistic and counterproductive. True gender equality isn't just about women becoming independent in isolation, but also about creating a society where both men and women are equally empowered to live fulfilling lives, free from the constraints of patriarchal norms. Women's independence is important, true, but it cannot be realistically achieved without the male involvement in feminist movements. We've proven so many times that men hold power in fields that women do not, so can help with systemic change. We'll still continue to crystallize this in our clashes.
POI.
We also keep pushing that our side harms women as victims. Yes, I'll take you, POI.
Do you think that the feminist movement is actually supposed to be centered on helping women get away from abuse and to help them find other help?
That's not what we said. We said that the feminist movement should be about empowering women and about achieving gender equality instead of villainizing men. Now, going back to rebuttals, they also keep pushing that our side harms women as victims. This is misguided, and also they fail to understand the core of our case. We don't depict women as victims. In fact, we empower them to take control of their own narratives and advocate for their equality. While the opposition focuses on isolating women in their struggle for independence, we recognize that gender equality is a collective effort that needs both men and women to achieve real equality. Moving on to summarizing the debate into main clashes. The first clash in this debate is about which side benefits the feminist movement the most. Ob tries to claim that men's involvement happens on both sides of the debate, so our impacts are actually mirrored. This is just false. The key difference is that we actively invite men into feminist conversations as allies, not just bystanders. We accept and we encourage male participation in the fight for gender equality. So we actually expand the scope of the feminist movements, allowing for more power and broader social change. We win this clash because feminism cannot succeed if it alienates half of the population. Excluding men from feminism weakens the movement and prevents real and widespread progress. Firstly, we win because including men in feminism widens the scope of change. Men are in positions of power in many areas, like government and law, in the status quo, where their influence can reshape societal norms. Without them, we're left with a fragmented movement that lacks the institutional power to tackle inequalities. Feminism needs the support of men to push through policy reforms and advocate for equal opportunities, especially in the many spaces of power that they are underrepresented in the status quo. Secondly, men are in the unique position to address gender-based inequalities, which are mostly in male-dominated spaces. Men can use their positions to call out inappropriate behavior and intervene. The core of this debate is which side empowers women more, and we obviously win this clash on scope and effectiveness. When men actively participate in the feminist movement, they are not only supporting gender equality, but also creating a culture of allyship that helps women thrive. Men can support women, and their own involvement makes the movement stronger because it makes gender equality the norm. The second clash in this debate is about which side benefits men. All pushes that men on our side are all portrayed as villains and feel attacked, and that the several men that we encourage to join feminist movements are, we see them and we're like, oh, so you're different from the rest of men. Several layers why we win. First, Ob's characterization of men is just uncharitable. We're not suggesting that men are inherently bad or that all men perpetuate patriarchic oppression, but we're saying that women should be cautious and because we live in a patriarchal society, we don't want women to become victims. We're not suggesting we're not suggesting that they're all bad. We argue that men, as a more privileged group, have an essential role in recognizing their privilege and using it to support women's equality. Second, OP fails to acknowledge that patriarchy also harms men because it limits their emotional freedom and their mental well-being. Men are pressured to adhere to ideals of masculinity and discourage emotional expression. By involving men, we give them the opportunity to reject harmful stereotypes and live authentically and express themselves. OP misunderstands the real benefits that men can gain from rejecting patriarchal norms. Third, they misunderstand feminist movements as a whole. Feminist movements don't attack men, but are actually just about advocating for equal treatment and dismantling systemic inequalities. By misunderstanding feminist movements as a whole, which are the main stakeholders in today's debate, they are already out of this debate. OP does not give any max on how their side leads to any systemic change and instead tries to undermine all of our arguments and our benefits, which already proves that we should take both clashes, even if the panel doesn't buy any of our weighing. Panel, this debate is clear. Our side is the unique side that strengthens feminist movements, which are the main stakeholder. We widen the scope of change of feminist movements and lead to more powerful movements. Opposition, in contrast, alienates men, so we urge you to vote for the side that leads to real and practical change. Vote prop. Thank you.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. Now call upon the third opposition speaker to close the substantive case for their bench.
Hi, am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Perfect. My name is Caden. I am opposition third. And assuming everyone is ready, verbal POIs, and time begins on my first word. Panel. Men shouldn't just walk across the street, see a feminist protest or something, and then think that women think a majority of his peers, him and his peers, are sexual assaulters and rapists. We can both agree on this on both sides of the house. A man should not have to feel that way. So then why tell us in your second speech that it is okay to think a majority of men are bad? And then why tell us in your third that you completely disagree with this framework and then say that in your third speech that we should all think that men are majority fine? So if we take their highest ground, why legitimize the thought that women even think this way in the first place and that women think that men are doing bad in the first place on average? You shine the spotlight on the wrong, off-track version of feminism on their side of the house, and you let the corrupted thought of blame perform. Don't turn on the spotlight, because when you do, you worsen the problem. In the speech, very simple, two clashes, and at the end, we'll weigh on why you give opposition the win, and we'll seal the deal with Chloe's speech. First clash then. How does the feminist movement look? What is this clash on? Early on, we told you that the feminist movement in the first place was never trying to point fingers about how men themselves were the problem, but the problems were social structures
POI.
that were intensified by history. No, thank you. Any idea when when feminists say, or as they claim they're feminists, when they say that they don't need men or how all men are the same, that's not just false and never happened, but it's actively rejected by the core feminist structure. We agree. We don't want to anger the patriarchy as they tell you in their first, because the fact that we simply need to fix the power balance by trying to be clean and to try to clean it that's the way in which we decrease toxicity. This is how feminist movements gain their power. This is how they move forward. However, they tell you that under opposition's world, we just accept blaming all men. They then say that it is important to show that some men are nice and that some are perpetrators. That's exactly what their first said. And then in their second, they do the concession and say that it isn't wrong to assume that a majority of men aren't nice anyway, because that is plausibly true and that the majority of men are bad actors. What is clearly wrong here? This is quite counterintuitive to their case. Their entire case is to be able to pivot the conversation away from what men are, and it should be towards what women can do. They did tell you this, that it's about empowering women in the first place. Yet, they tell you that it is fine to think that all men are bad, and then what's the point in accepting their narrative? Well, if we accept the not all men narrative, then it shifts the focus onto what men are about instead of going back to helping women, giving them empowerment and maybe safety from like their rape experiences, just like we did in the Me Too movement. I think all sides of the house can agree that the core part of the feminist movement was to empower people so that they can find help or talk about the experiences
POI.
so that they could heal about it. I'll take it later. If that's the most important, then we don't want to shift away from the women, and yet on their side of the house, embracing a narrative would decrease the attention span you give towards women and shift it more towards men. Now, even if you do take their like analysis on how we still need men to be able to solve these problems because the patriarchy is in the position of power, I'll talk about it in the highest ground. But in the first place, I don't think that the most amount of solvency or the probability that you have men going to do the majority of work for you, it should be female led, and that's exactly what the feminist movement has been doing in the past. That's the most ground that the feminist movement has been given in the first place, when it was female led and when the core was about what women could do for themselves too. That's the entire Me Too movement that we're talking about, where women talk about their experiences. This is feminism. So some concessions before I take their point. I'll bite the bullet here. Somehow, if it is that the majority of men are rapists, which would be their highest ground, why would the not all men narrative protect the small minority of God send nice guys on their side? Because again, isn't the idea to make it easier to accept men? Isn't the idea for the feminist movement to see them as allies? But yet their side claims that the majority of men in their second is bad, then therefore we would have less
POI.
allies on their side of the house. Because of this like subconscious acceptance that they make on proposition side, you have to assume that then they get less allies in the long run. And I think it's pretty clear who this clash goes to. So the final way, organically, it's an actor motion. What the feminist movement wants is to focus more on women empowerment, not as much as fearing men. And whatever world they give you, you know that embracing a narrative that
Point
centers
of
men would
information.
decrease, I'll take it later, thank you, will decrease vision for the conversations that are supposed to surround women that were hurt and protecting the vulnerable. Just as they say, don't villainize men and fight for equality. Okay, I'll take your point now.
Sure. So I think this rebuttal is insufficient in the sense that Lauren told you in her next sentence, the reason the vast majority of men are like evil in the status quo is because you antagonize them actively on your side of the house by
Okay, so
continuing
I'm sorry. I
what the
think there's a
feminist movement
mischaracterization here.
like,
We already
like,
told you 3 times in Samuel's speech. Thank you. We already told you 3 times in Samuel's speech why this wasn't true. We gave you what the status quo actually looked like, and you never responded to it in your third. So if you're already going to reject the stuff and the footwork that we've given you in our past speeches, I don't think that you can say this is what our background looks like. We already told you what our background looks like. The background looks like the purest form of feminism, where we focus on what women need instead of what men should look like according to whatever rhetoric you're trying to give us on your side of the house. So anyways, that's what we're talking about. Moving on, the final way for the first clash. Why do we tie it back to women on our side of the house? Well, how is it saying that there are some good men going to get those that have power to change actually listen to you? They never gave you the mechanism here, and they never told you this. They only connected that protecting that minute amount of men means that powerful men would help you. Of course, you can gut check this yourself. Obviously, this clash goes to opposition. Clash number 2 then. How do men look, or how does it benefit men? I think that we know the interpretation of men, of how they are seen, is important here, and it matters to feminism still at the end of the day. But note, they unfortunately never heard the part of Samuel's speech where we told you that we never thought the majority of men were bad, but also we shouldn't fear people simply because they are men. We told you that what it looks like when we do take men into account and we do have to put a spotlight onto men, it looks like pointing out red flags. It looks like pattern recognition of what men are actually toxic instead of saying that men are toxic in the first place, so that we can be more specific instead of having to run to a generalized narrative that proposition wants you to accept. But then there's their side. There was conflict. Their second told you that it was good to think a majority of men were bad, and then the third says it is bad to think this way and that we should have the majority of men being good. Other than the conflict, if that conflict never happened, we still don't have a lineup here. If they try to clear it up in the reply, it's too late. What's wrong? On the face, there are 2 things. One, I think the way men are perceived is only in a way we can decrease the toxicity in the patriarchy. We should understand what good men look like, and then we understand what bad men look like, instead of simply saying that good men exist amongst a sea of bad men. Also, the second layer to this is I think that even if men do look good on their side of the house, they don't get any access because their allyship is lower. You have a lower amount of men that you perceive as good under their narrative because, again, it's limiting the amount of good men that exist instead of assuming that is the majority. Because of that, you get less allies in the long run. And if allyship is the most important in having equality and being able to work together, I think you want to buy that on our side of the house. At least we don't restrict the amount of men that could be perceived as good. This is why you oppose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. Now, moving on to the reply section of the debate. First, I'd like to call upon opposition reply. Here.
Hey, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Time my first word. This debate has been very messy today, and side opposition has been very disappointed at how proposition carried out their characterization down the bench. In this last speech, I will seal the deal by simply crystallizing what they gave us and reiterating our own arguments. Now, exactly what has prop given us? Alex first comes up here and tells us that, oh, the feminist movement poses us with a lot of problems in the status quo, that it negatively stigmatizes men in its very nature, and that we need to teach women how to safely identify perpetrators in the first place. Okay, then Lauren comes up here and tells you that men in their world are mostly on average are intrinsically bad people anyway. And finally, Elizabeth tells you that we need to do everything we can to push the feminist movement forward. Firstly, I just want to say, pick your poison. You can't have all three priorities granted on either side today, but let me hold them to their highest and explain why it's net zero at the end of the day anyway, even if you buy all of their claims. First off, with Alex, the feminist movement needs to be fixed. Okay, their plan was to fix the mindsets of all feminists alike and to believe that the majority of men are good in its own nature. Okay, I think it's judicial and a bargain at best if it's easier said than done to complete this plan in the first place, and the narrative that the motion presents to us today cannot revert to what victims have experienced. Panel, don't let them undermine our contention too, because they were the ones who were protected from sexual assault in the first place. Now on to Lauren. We have her concession that most men on their side of the house are bad actors anyway. Okay, so if we automatically concede that almost everyone is villainous on their side, then this only decreases vision and productivity for the conversations and negotiations happening in the movement anyway, because there's no point in dealing and talking sense into antagonists in the first place, which ultimately they'll result in a net zero movement or differentiation anyway. So there's going to be no impact on their side. Now, lastly, Elizabeth wants to empower the movement and change the courses of our life forever. I applaud that, but I think that this is already being granted in the status quo. What change do you want to bring about? They never specified their plan. They just want to empower the status quo more than it already is anyway. Well, this is exactly where we start to transition over to Ops plan, because this is exactly what we will be giving to you, an equal arms race of negotiation to peace and gender equality without an added topper of this narrative just to sweep it all up, to clean everything up. I think we win the plan for a few reasons. Firstly, under Op, we actually see the feminist movement gaining things and taking shape and actually having better gains in the long run anyway. But secondly, we actually see gender equality on our side of the house for a number of key reasons down the bench. And thirdly, we actually see nobody getting demonized anyway in the first place, no matter if you're a man or woman. I think we have everybody treated equally in the same space. Panel, now I want to move over to our world. We have given you our characterization right off the bench. Firstly, what does the feminist movement want in terms of how men are perceived? Secondly, what does effective feminist communication require? And thirdly, why do men even feel attacked in the first place and think that they need the not all men narrative? We have communicated We have communicated all of this. Moving on to our substance, we have the first argument where we explain how the narrative individualizes what is fundamentally structural, where essentially feminism analyzes patriarchy as a system and is bad for the movement for three reasons. Firstly, it blocks the path to policies being negotiated. Secondly, because of cultural shifts. And thirdly, because allyship needed for liberation. Now, moving on to our second argument, which is delegitimizing trauma and victims of sexual assault. As a collective society, we think and we value and we respect the stories of victims insofar as it provides an unfiltered experience of the dehumanization and the pain that you can go through and that you have been put through. When the narrative aims to essentially filter out what can be considered harmful, we actually silence and completely disregard the voices of the people and victims alike on their side. Now, the last thing we give you is how it overshadows the root problem. Ultimately, when this narrative of not all men is used to combat what is perceived as overgeneralization of an entire gender, it just completely fails to grasp the core and fundamental injustices present in our status quo. For example, the trauma, inequality, vulnerability that people face. Now, for all of these reasons, we are so proud to oppose the motion today.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. Finally, call upon top reply to close the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
Look past the rhetoric of side opposition and you'll see the critical flaw that cost them today's debate. Firstly, then, we think the only constant thing that is pushed down the bench in side opposition is this idea that they will portray men as men, which is to say that they will portray men as good or bad. How does this critically damage their case then? Firstly, we think this damages Ops' unique stance as it makes their case indistinguishable from ours. Why is that so? Panel, look over your flow. We told you from the get-go that we would take the basic idea of this narrative that not all men are bad and thus it is okay to ally yourselves and interact with men, which is precisely what Lauren and Elizabeth pushed in second and third. Know that we also expand on that by educating women, etc., to identify abusive men from things like behavior in relationships while also addressing harms against existing victims. Know that Lauren and Elizabeth continues this down the bench. Know that firstly, Lauren explains in second why we protect women from men who are antagonized on their side of the house, while Elizabeth explained in third that we win on the clashes. None of this means that if Op wants to tell you that they are doing the same thing, this is precisely what we are supporting, and that already cost them this debate by removing the uniqueness of their case. Secondly, then, on the case shifts present within opposition stance. Firstly, we think there's a massive difference between first and second, where first pushed that it is immoral to portray all men as evil, while second told you that we need to protect victims from evil men who assault them. Note that the nail in the coffin comes in third, where they case shift and decide to support an ideologically pure version of feminism while rebutting our case with only one line on how Lauren contradicts our stance. Moving on then, let's explain why our unified stance on proposition wins us this debate. What have we told you? We told you from the get-go three major things. Firstly, we explained to you how our counterfactual would look like. That's say that we would adopt the basic nature of this narrative by shifting the focus of the feminist movement on the specific men who are abusing people while also inviting other men who are good, etc., to join the movement, right? I think this is very simple. They've never really challenged our counterfactual in today's debate. Secondly, then, we gave you a piece of framing on how their counterfactual is likely to be portraying all men as evil, because that is just what the feminist movement has been doing for ages, and that is also why currently men hate women, because they are influenced by this, right? We think this is something that the feminist movement has been doing for ages and therefore is still likely to do on their side of the house. Why is this critical to their case then? Now that we think this critically damaged their case because they never really engage with our comparative, and they assert that their counterfactual is likely to be like our counterfactual in the sense that they portray men as men, so that there's going to be good men and bad men, right? We think this is something that is bad because they asserted this, and this is basically indistinguishable from our case. We then give you two arguments that were pushed down the bench. Firstly, then, the feminism is facing lots of problems due to the fact that they are pushing this narrative of men being evil in the status quo and therefore alienating the power brokers and important people that are important for enacting change to protect women on the ground. And secondly, on how we prioritize education for women to make them less vulnerable to abuse. Know that we get really no rebuttals whatsoever to the logic links in these arguments and the mechanization of these points. We think they still stand. Moving on then, know that we think the only rebuttal rebuttal they give us is that they say Lauren contradicts our case, right? I think this is a very absurd claim in the sense they only listen to Lauren's first sentence. Lauren said before that and immediately after that by telling you that the reason men currently are evil is because the feminist movement alienates them on their side of the house by continuing to push the narrative that men are evil. We don't think they heard this. This rebuttal falls. Ultimately, panel, we outweigh in terms of the magnitude and scope of impact. Recognize they gave us no sufficient rebuttal whatsoever. They are already failing in today's debate.
I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech and all speakers for this wonderful debate. Debaters, feel free to cross the floor. Um, I think we can join room 4 for deliberation. I don't think there's a debate there right now.